3, 2, 1. Okay, welcome. We're about to get started on this presentation. So if you're watching on Facebook and you're on mute, now is the time to turn your volume up, please. Turn your volume up. We're getting started now. So welcome to Emotional Intelligence for Dads. I'm Scott Davison from the Dad Train, and this presentation is brought to you on behalf of the Moreland City Libraries. Now, we were going to be doing a longer offline version of this workshop, but obviously due to the current circumstances, what we're giving you today is a condensed online version of Emotional Intelligence for Dads. But even though it's condensed, you're still going to get a lot of value, so stick around. We'll cover at a high level what emotional intelligence is, and I'm going to give you 5 things you can start doing today to improve your own emotional intelligence, as well as 5 things you can do to help teach your kids this skill. So stick around. Let's get started. First things first, acknowledgement of country. So Moreland City Libraries acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people as the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways in the area known as Moreland. We pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, as well as to all First Nation communities who contribute to life in the area. Thank you. This is a photo of me and my family, my son Luca and my wife Agus. Now, my wife and I have very different emotional styles. I'm not just talking about the normal male-female differences, but much deeper than that. For instance, Agus, my wife, is Argentinian, so she comes from a Latin background, a Latin culture, where they're very passionate and expressive in their emotions, so she's very used to that. I come from an Australian-British background where we're a bit more reserved, and I've kind of grown up managing my emotions by keeping them to myself and to some extent hiding them, which to a large degree has served me quite well. But when I became a husband and a father, I realised there was a bit of a weakness there, and I needed to get better at empathizing and reading and understanding emotions of other people. That's when I started looking into this area of emotional intelligence, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So this is a quote by Daniel Goleman, who wrote the book Emotional Intelligence, and he talks about it in this way of being 2 different brains. Now, whilst we don't actually have 2 different brains, we do know that the parts of the brain that function for emotions is a completely different part of the brain to where the rational intelligence happens. So rational thinking happens in the frontal cortex, the upper part of the brain, whereas the emotions are triggered in the lower, more primitive reptilian part of the brain. So that whilst we don't have 2 different brains, they are very different parts of the brain and very different types of intelligence. It's quite possible for someone to have a high IQ but have very low emotional intelligence, or EQ, and vice versa. The opposite is also possible. We probably all know people like this. The other way these types of intelligence are quite different is that traditional, I guess, IQ intelligence, it's actually quite hard to change your IQ over time. It's relatively fixed. Whereas emotional intelligence is something that we can quite easily develop. So it's a really good one for us to focus on, because we can do things that will improve our own emotional intelligence and help our kids develop their emotional intelligence. So that's what we're going to look at now. Firstly, let's start with ourselves. Always the best place to start. If you want to teach your kids something, you need to be able to do it yourself and model it. So building your self-awareness is the first step. So this is about learning to recognize emotions in yourself. And there are lots of different ways to do this, but 2 ideas I wanted to share was mindfulness or meditation can be a really good way to start to observe both your thoughts but also your feelings, so observing your emotions. And journaling. A lot of people use journaling as a way to start to jot down the different emotions or feelings they've had during the day. Some people call that a mood book. That can be a really good way to increase your self-awareness of your emotions, that is. Now, talking about emotions, this is probably the most important. And as guys, we're not traditionally very good at this. We tend to not talk about our emotions a lot, but we should. So start talking about your emotions. Talk about them with your partner. Talk about them with your kids, and talk about them with your mates. It's a really good way to increase your emotional intelligence just by talking about your feelings. Using your body now, this is really important. What we're talking about here is the link between physiology and emotions. And your body can be used in two ways. Firstly, your body can be a really good way to recognize emotions. A lot of the early signs of emotions will trigger physical responses in our body. You often blush before you even realize you're embarrassed, or you'll feel butterflies in your stomach when you're nervous. These are very primitive responses that are built into our genes. So if we can learn to notice those triggers, the early signs of emotions, that's a really good way to increase our self-awareness. But also, the opposite is also true. So just as emotions will trigger physical responses in our body, we can also use our body to trigger emotional responses. I'll give you a really quick example of what I'm talking about, and you can play along at home for this one. So if you've got a pen, grab your pen, stick it in your teeth like this. If you don't have a pen, no problem. Just put a big smile on your face. Shoulders back. If you can stand up, stand up. And as you, like this, with a big smile on your face, shoulders back, keep smiling, and I want you to try and be sad, okay? Try and think sad thoughts. It's really hard. It's really hard to be sad while we're smiling. Okay, shake it off. So what's happening there is your body is sending a message to your brain to say, hey, I'm happy, I'm smiling. So it's actually really hard to be sad while your body's triggering that response. Now, that's just a really simple example, but if you want to look a bit more into this space, we don't have time today, but I'll point you to a TED Talk by Amy Cuddy, which looks into the link between body language, body posture, and emotions. And it's a really good, interesting TED Talk, so please go and check that out. But my point here is start using your body, firstly, to recognize emotions, but secondly, to manage your emotions or to regulate your emotions. So if you're feeling a bit stressed, get up and take a walk. If you're feeling a bit nervous or a bit scared, take a few deep breaths. That's a really good way of using your body to calm yourself down. Secondly, the next one is about bodies again, but this time reading the body language of other people. So as we mentioned, emotions will often show up in the body, and we know a lot of communication is non-verbal. So learning to read facial expressions and body language of other people is a really good way to increase your empathy. Now, again, different ways you can do this. There's some online tests that will allow you to look at facial expressions and guess the emotions. But the trick I like to talk about here is the TV trick. So that is watching a TV program. I'm not talking about football or sport, but watching maybe a drama with the volume down or on mute. And you try to follow the storyline and the emotions just by reading the body language and the facial expression of the characters. It's a really good way to start to increase your empathy and this skill of reading other people's emotions. And the final one for today, probably the simplest but best trick I can give you, is the 2-second rule, or the power of the pause. What we're talking about here is using the pause. So if you're in a situation where you notice your own emotions building, or perhaps you notice the other person is getting emotional, just employ the 2-second rule, which is this. You pause for just 2 seconds before you respond. And that 2 seconds is just enough for your rational brain to catch up with your emotional brain. The emotional brain tends to trigger things a lot faster. That gives you a bit more time for the rational brain to catch up. And it's really the difference between reacting and responding. And it can make a really big difference to your emotional intelligence, just that simple rule. Next thing I always get asked is, okay, that's great for us. How do we help our children develop their emotional intelligence? And the good news is it's a very easy skill to help children develop from a young age. So we'll look at a couple of ways of doing that. The first one is modeling the behavior yourself. This is always the best way to teach children something. So if they can see you dealing with your emotions, talking about your emotions, treating emotions like real things, that's a great way for your children to start developing their own emotional intelligence. So always start with that. Validating your kids' emotions is really important. I had an example of this just last night. Our 2-year-old boy woke up in the middle of the night. He was crying, almost hysterical, and he was freaking out about an embroidered picture of a cat that's on one of his bed sheets. Now, that's always been there, but for some reason he was very scared of it last night. And, you know, I could have said, come on, Luca, don't be silly. It's just a cat. It's always been there. You can't be scared of that. But they're his feelings. They're his emotions. They're real. We don't choose our emotions, kids or adults. We don't actually have any control over what we feel. We can control how we respond to that, but the feeling itself is real and it's not something we control. So it's really important that you help kids by validating their emotions, help them understand that those feelings are real, and definitely never dismiss them or say, come on, don't be silly, you can't feel that. We need kids to understand emotions are real. Role-playing games is a really good way to help children develop their empathy because they're putting themselves in someone else's shoes. They're seeing the world through someone else's eyes. So doing role-playing games can be great for that, and reading fictional novels is another really good way to do that. Number 4, again, talking about emotions, talking with your kids as often as possible about their feelings and their emotions. There are different ways to do this depending on the age of the kids, but one good tactic is just at the end of the day, you do your best, ask them what was the best thing that happened to them and the worst thing that happened today, and that's a way to start a conversation about how they felt. A lot of people use emotion charts as well. This is a really good way of helping kids when you're talking to them about emotions, depending on their age, different emotion charts. You've probably seen those ones with pictures of smiley faces and frowny faces. That just helps kids at a young age to be able to point to or circle the feeling that they've had or they're having at that time. So emotion charts are a really good trick to help kids. On that topic, I want to quickly show you this one. This is the feeling wheel. This is a tool I've developed for the dad train, probably for older kids or for adults. And this is a way to expand your emotional vocabulary. Men traditionally have smaller emotional vocabularies than women, interestingly. So this is a really good way for us to start building our emotional literacy. There's 160 different emotions here, and you can, instead of just saying you're feeling angry, you can start to work your way out and delve into some of the emotions behind that, some of the deeper emotions. So this is a really good tool. If you want to get your hands on that, just go to thedadtrain.com/feeling wheel, and you can download a high-res version that you print off and put on your wall or your fridge and use it to help your kids talk about their emotions, but also help yourself expand your own emotional vocabulary. Plenty of other tools I wanted to go through that we don't have time for today, but if you go to the dadtrain.com website there, I've got various articles on these topics, or you can follow me on social media, and I'm sharing content around that, and more recently the Dad Train podcast. Now, both the website, social media, and the podcast, really what they're about is sharing ideas and strategies on how we can be better men, better partners, and better dads. So please check those out, and if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to me on social media. That's all we've got time for today. If you're watching this video live on Facebook, stick around. We're going to do a live Q&A right now. If you're watching the replay of this video, then you can put your questions in the comments below and we'll respond to them there. Thank you very much for taking the time today to start looking at this area of emotional intelligence. As I say, it's a really important skill for us to develop as men and as dads. So thank you for starting your journey, and good luck continuing your journey to increase your emotional intelligence. I'm Scott Davison from the Dad Train, and you've been watching the Emotional Intelligence for Dads training. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.